being in Turkey and one of her first teaching jobs, where she was teaching first certificate students. And she'd been teaching for about 3 years. Her teaching moment was more about a frustration that she had with the students who were messing around and not really taking things seriously. She was standing at the board one day and she was about to write a sentence, but instead of writing the sentence, her inner thoughts came out and she wrote shit on the board. And so this caused a lot of embarrassment, but a lot of hilarity with the students. And it was an interesting point because in the short term, it actually allowed her to talk to the students about why she was feeling frustrated with them and why the way they were behaving in the class wasn't really doing them any favors in terms of their exam-based classes that they were working on. But and this was a positive outcome for some of the students who were also frustrated by some of the other students who were behaving in that way. In the long term, though, it had a bigger implication because she was able to understand or to come to the realization that she needed to consider her boundaries with students and the relationships she had with them. And while she needed to form relationships with them, she also needed to keep a certain level of distance and an authoritative kind of role. And she felt that this helped her a lot in her future teaching situations. And that's our teaching moment.
Thank you. Did you have any comments on doing the task, Jan, from your group?
Yeah, we really enjoyed doing the task. The three of us were all teacher trainers and educators, and we felt that having the different roles and being able to focus on one thing at a time was very, very useful. We also were able to tap into each other's roles as I think the observer was able to understand how both the understander and the teacher were working together, and also the complexity of trying to take on those roles. And we also liked the way it brought out thoughts and ideas that perhaps hadn't really been fully explored because of this non-judgmental matter. And I felt as the observer that I was able to focus very much into what I was hearing and think about what this really meant. So yeah, we found it very useful, and we would use the task again. We all decided.
Okay, thank you. Alwyn, do you want to move on, or did you want to say?
No, Carol, I don't want to comment now. I think that what we're doing now is sharing these ideas, and that's really, really interesting to hear. So we just go on to the next person.
Yeah. So Kevin, would you like to? We've got Kevin, and then I think Michelle after that.
Yeah, I'll be sharing Eva's teaching experience, and Gemma was the understander in our group. Eva's lesson was with health and nutrition postgraduate students, and the aim of the lesson originally was to develop listening and note-taking skills. And the students had requested something on memory from Netflix, so she'd prepared a lesson around this, and she had a planned lesson. But what happened actually was that the students started coming in with a lot of experiences from their work in care homes and experiences with memory with the elderly people in these care homes where they were working. And I think what she did was she kind of handed the lesson over to the students and let them use their real life experiences to discuss memory rather than relying on the Netflix materials. So what was going on there was they were talking about memory strategies through their own experiences. They were actively engaging with each other. They were also actively listening. They were practicing actively listening and note-taking. The students who didn't have the experiences were able to step in and they were able to do the active note taking because they didn't actually have the practical experience. So I think what Eva said was basically, what she said was she'd learned the value of keeping quiet at certain moments and probably giving more agency to the students in this specific lesson. I hope I'm doing it justice, Eva. I'm sorry if I'm not. And it was an opportunity for her to get to know the students better as well, because I could imagine that that would be the case, because as long as the teacher's in the lead, perhaps you don't have the time to get to know the students so well. So yes, it seemed to be a better communicative experience than the original design would have been. So it sounded like a very positive example, and that she learned from that something about herself as a teacher and her position in relation to the students.
And how did you all find the task?
Well, we had a little bit of a problem trying to work out who was the understander and who was the observer, but after a brief negotiation, we decided who had what role. No, I think it went really well. I think as observer, I was really glad that Gemma was the understander and that she was the one who was interlocuting with Eva, and that allowed me to develop my own note-taking skills and use my multicolored pens to do so. So my colleagues were greatly impressed by my coloured pens, if not by my handwriting, I believe.
Just beautiful colours, beautiful.
Thank you.
And as speaker, it really made me reflect on the lesson I was describing, and the listener asked me some good questions that got to sort of aims and classroom management and motivations as well. So it was an interesting experience. I like it. I might replicate it.
And were there any comments about anxiety, reduction of, increase, or in doing that task?
I do have a comment, if I'm allowed to come in. I think, you know, this kind of experience actually happens quite a lot in the staff room, whether it's virtual or face-to-face. And I mean, I'm sure you're all in very similar position. Well, I don't know if you are actually, but in our team, we've had a real struggle to get anyone on any kind of permanent contracts. So we're in a position now where we've got a few people on permanent contracts and a massive team of people on BL contracts. So trying to fit peer observation in, especially when people are in theory not paid for it or won't be paid any extra for doing it, is a real juggling act, and we're sort of looking for some guidance, please. But I think that kind of thing does happen in staff rooms, and you know, if we can perhaps even get some funding for, you know, a meeting just to focus on that for 2 hours a term, it would be helpful, and to do that activity. And I think it would reduce a lot of potential stress. But of course, observations, and especially peer observations with BLs, are just right down the bottom of the list of priorities. And everyone's been so busy and the team's grown so hugely rapidly, it's really impossible to keep up. So any advice from anyone would be really welcome. Thank you.
Do you mean in terms of getting funding or having opportunities?
Yeah, just finding opportunities within that context to actually be able to do it.
I'm not going to say anything just now. I'll tell you later if we've got time, what we do in Glasgow for that. Michelle, thank you very much. I'm going to move on just for time.
Okay. Well, we approached the task a little bit differently, because what we focused on was trying to figure out from what somebody said what their underlying sort of view of what was important in teaching was, or came through from what they were saying. So I observed Kerith, and she was talking about a class where the students were doing a task, and at the end of that first task, she said, so here's what we've learned from that task. Here's the top tip. And then she went on to do a second task. Now, there were 5 top tips that were supposed to come out of this lesson. She got to the end of the second task and she said, so what was the top tip from the first task? And nobody could remember what it was, which threw her a little bit because she'd said it, but nobody had actually learned it. So she then decided that she would change her approach and throughout the rest of the lesson, make sure that the students were working out amongst themselves what the learning point was at each end of stage, so that you know, by the end of the lesson they had their 5 top tips, but she hadn't given them to her. And I thought, listening to that, you know, obviously an underlying belief that she has is that students will learn better if they're working out the learning points themselves, if they're guided towards it. But if they're working things out for themselves, they're going to understand things better and they're going to learn things better than if she's a talking head and she tells them things and expects them to just understand it and remember it, and to work out what are the learning points and what are just the bits of the task or the steps of the task that they're having to go through. So that was one point in a lesson that we talked about. The other one was a bit different. Emma talked about hybrid teaching. She's just started hybrid teaching, and she's got some students in front of her and some students on a big screen behind her, calling into the lesson. And she's constantly having to interrupt her lesson to bring the online students into the lesson and to get them involved in the lesson rather than just observing the lesson. And that I think that was a slightly different thing, because it wasn't to do really with learning, it was more to do with classroom management. But when we looked at that, we said an underlying belief that she has is that there must be an inclusive classroom, that everybody must be engaged in what's going on in the classroom, and you're not going to learn if you're just observing other people doing stuff. You need to be involved in the lesson as well. So those were the 2 that we did, and those were the beliefs that we pulled out of them, and other people might be able to pull other beliefs out of them.
It is, thank you. I've just put in the chat, would anyone else like to report? I'm having trying to see everyone, see if anyone's got their hand up. There's been some really good stuff coming through on the chat here. Well, what we've got, because we can see people adding things into the chat, and I think things are getting added onto the feed on the Padlet also, and we've taken some notes to try and summarize people that gave an oral summary, and we'll tidy all of that up and share that via all our social media links with our fantastic social media and events people on in our SIG. I think, I don't know, Alwyn, if you want a final closing comment or not. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to Stella.
So I just want to say thanks for everybody for engaging with the task. It sounds as though you enjoyed it, and there's some really insightful comments coming out, and on Padlet as well. So keep adding those. But I enjoyed working up this workshop and thinking about the task and thinking about observation. So thanks very much for that opportunity, Carol.
And a big thank you, Owen, for working up the worksheet and coming and talking and